In the bitter winter of 1829, when the Russian steppes lay buried beneath 3 feet of snow and the wind howled like tortured souls through the pine forests, villagers in the remote settlement of Volchansk began to hear something that would haunt them for generations. It wasn't the usual sounds of winter, not the cracking of ice or the groaning of ancient wood under snow's weight. No, this was different. This was the sound of children screaming in the distance, carried on the wind from the direction of the old Petrov estate. But here's what made their blood freeze in their veins. Those screams always came at feeding time, always at dusk, always when the wolves were hungriest. The villagers told themselves it was just the wind, just their imagination playing tricks in the endless white silence of Russian winter. They were wrong. What they were hearing was the systematic destruction of innocence by a woman whose beauty masked a hunger more savage than any wolf that ever stalked those frozen forests. Her name was Katerina Volkova, and she had just become a bride. But the children she was feeding to the wolves weren't livestock. They were human, and they were still alive when she threw them to the pack. The screams the villagers heard weren't the wind at all. They were the last cries of dozens of children whose only crime was trusting a woman with eyes like winter and a smile that promised warmth but delivered only death. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. The Volchansk settlement sat like a forgotten wound on the vast canvas of Imperial Russia, where Tsar Nicholas I ruled with an iron fist, and the Orthodox Church held dominion over every soul from Moscow to the Siberian wastes. This was a land where superstition and faith danced together in the candlelit corners of wooden churches. Bim-bam-bim-bow-boom. Here, peasants crossed themselves at the mention of wolves and whispered prayers against the evil eye. Life moved slowly here, measured not by clocks but by the rhythm of seasons, planting in the brief summer, harvesting in the golden autumn, and surviving the brutal winter that could last 8 months. The villagers of Volchansk were hardy folk, descendants of Cossacks and serfs who had learned to endure whatever God or the Tsar threw at them. They worked the land, raised their children, and buried their dead in the frozen ground behind the small wooden church that served as the heart of their community. But even in this harsh land, there were rules. There were boundaries. There were things that civilized people simply did not do. And in the winter of 1829, those boundaries were about to be shattered by a woman who understood that the greatest monsters aren't born, they're made. The villagers should have known something was wrong when the wolves began gathering in unprecedented numbers around the Petrov estate. They should have noticed that the howling grew louder each night, but they were simple people, trusting people, and they had no idea that evil could wear the face of a beautiful bride. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Katerina Volkova arrived in Volchansk like a vision from another world, her sleigh pulled by 3 white horses that seemed to float across the snow. She was 22 years old, with raven black hair that cascaded down her back like spilled ink, and eyes the color of winter ice that seemed to look right through a man's soul. The local matchmaker had arranged her marriage to Dmitry Petrov, a widowed landowner whose first wife had died under mysterious circumstances 3 years earlier. Dmitry was 45, wealthy by local standards and desperately lonely. He owned vast tracts of land that stretched to the edge of the Great Forest, land that came with an ancient curse the villagers whispered about but never fully explained. Katerina had come from St. Petersburg, or so she claimed, though no one could verify her story. She spoke with refinement, carried herself like nobility, and had enough gold to buy herself a place in Dmitry's heart and bed. But there were things about Katerina that should have raised questions. The way she never attended church services, claiming sudden illnesses that seemed to strike only on Sundays. The way she smiled when she heard news of accidents or deaths in the village. A small, secret smile that never quite reached those ice-blue eyes. The way she insisted on taking long walks alone in the forest, even in the depths of winter, returning with her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright with an excitement that seemed almost sexual. Most disturbing of all was her relationship with the local children. They were drawn to her like moths to flame, clustering around her whenever she appeared in the village square, mesmerized by her beauty and the expensive sweets she carried in her fur-lined pockets. She knew all their names, remembered their birthdays, and seemed genuinely interested in their innocent chatter about games and dreams and fears. The disappearances began 3 weeks after the wedding, though at first no one connected them to the radiant new bride who had brought such life to the grieving widower's mansion. It started with Pavel Morozov, a 7-year-old boy with bright red hair and a gap-toothed grin who sold firewood door to door to help feed his younger siblings. His mother sent him out on a Tuesday morning with his small sledge loaded with carefully split birch logs. He never came home. The search parties found his sledge overturned near the forest edge, the wood scattered across the snow, but no sign of Pavel himself. The villagers assumed wolves. Winter was always hard, and hungry packs sometimes ventured closer to human settlements than anyone felt comfortable with. But when little Anya Kozlov vanished the following week while collecting eggs from her family's chicken coop, and then Mikhail Petrov, no relation to Dmitry, disappeared on his way to morning prayers, a different kind of fear began to settle over Volchansk like fog. These weren't random wolf attacks. Wolves were savage, but they were also efficient. They killed quickly, devoured their prey, and left bones picked clean. They didn't simply make children vanish without a trace. The village elder, a weathered man named Fyodor, who had seen 70 winters, gathered the men in the church basement to discuss what was becoming an epidemic of lost children. Some spoke of evil spirits awakened by the early wedding celebration. Others whispered about the old curse on the Petrov lands, the one that stretched back 3 generations to Dmitry's great-grandfather, who had supposedly made a pact with dark forces to protect his property from raiders and bandits. But no one, not even wise old Fyodor, suspected that evil might be wearing a wedding dress and living in the big house on the hill. The truth began to emerge on a night when the northern lights painted the sky in shades of green and gold, casting an otherworldly glow across the snow-covered landscape. Dmitry Petrov had been drinking heavily, a habit that had worsened since his marriage to the beautiful Katerina, and had passed out in his study beside a roaring fire. He awoke near midnight to the sound of his wife moving through the house, her footsteps light but purposeful. Curiosity overcoming his drunken stupor, he followed the sound, keeping to the shadows as Katerina made her way to the root cellar beneath the kitchen. What he saw there would drive him to madness within a month and to suicide before the spring thaw. The cellar, which should have contained only preserved vegetables and salted meat for winter, had been transformed into something that belonged in the depths of hell itself. Iron cages lined the walls, cages barely large enough to hold a crouching child, and they weren't empty. In the flickering light of Katerina's oil lamp, Dmitry could see small faces peering out through the bars, dirty, terrified faces of children he recognized from the village. They were thin, so thin their eyes seemed enormous in their starved faces, but they were alive, barely, but alive. Katerina moved among the cages with the efficiency of a farmer checking livestock, occasionally reaching through the bars to stroke a child's hair or whisper something in a language Dmitry didn't recognize. At the far end of the cellar stood a heavy wooden door that Dmitry had never noticed before, a door that was slightly ajar. Through that opening came sounds that made his soul recoil, the sound of wolves feeding, growling and tearing at flesh, and underneath it all, fading screams that were almost but not quite human. His beautiful wife, his savior from loneliness, was feeding the village children to a pack of wolves she kept in a hidden chamber beneath their home. The horrifying discovery in Dmitry's cellar was only the beginning of a revelation that would expose the true depths of Katerina's systematic evil. As Dmitry watched in paralyzed terror, his wife selected a small girl from one of the cages, Vera Antonova, the baker's daughter, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The child was too weak from starvation and terror to resist, as Katerina lifted her with surprising strength and carried her toward that terrible door. But what happened next revealed the true sophistication of Katerina's operation. She didn't simply throw the child to the wolves. Instead, she carried Vera into the hidden chamber, where a dozen wolves waited in a space that had been excavated and reinforced with stone and timber. These weren't wild wolves, as driven by simple hunger. These were animals that had been trained, conditioned, turned into instruments of a specific and terrible purpose. Katerina had taught them to kill slowly, to begin feeding while their victims were still conscious, still aware of what was happening to them. She had trained them to respond to her commands, to start and stop their feeding at her will. The wolves weren't just her murder weapons, they were her audience, her congregation in a religion of deliberate cruelty that she had been perfecting for years. As Vera's screams echoed through the chamber, mixing with the growls and snarls of the pack, Dmitri realized with crystalline horror that his wife wasn't just a killer. She was an artist, and children's terror was her medium. She watched each death with the focused intensity of a composer conducting a symphony, her face lit with an ecstasy that was both spiritual and sexual. This wasn't madness. This was something far worse. It was methodical evil, carefully planned and expertly executed by someone who had discovered that the suffering of innocence could feed hungers that ordinary food could never satisfy. The scope of Katerina's operation became clear when Dmitri, driven by a horrified compulsion he couldn't resist, began to explore the hidden chambers beneath his own home. What he found was an underground network that extended far beyond the wolf den, a complex of tunnels and rooms that had been carved out over months, perhaps years. Some chambers served as additional holding areas for children, equipped with shackles and chains that showed signs of long use. Others contained supplies, ropes, knives, medical instruments, and detailed journals written in Katerina's precise handwriting. The journals revealed the true horror. She had been documenting everything, every child's capture, every reaction to captivity, every scream, every plea for mercy. She had been keeping meticulous records of which methods of terror produced the most satisfying responses, which ages provided the most entertainment, which gender cried more beautifully. The entries read like scientific reports, clinical observations of human suffering written in the same tone another person might use to describe the weather. But perhaps most chilling were the maps she had drawn, showing not just Volchansk but dozens of other villages and towns across the Russian Empire. Each location was marked with numbers that corresponded to entries in her journals describing previous operations, previous collections of children, previous feeding sessions with wolf packs she had assembled in other places. Katerina Volkova wasn't a local madwoman who had snapped under the pressures of rural isolation. She was a traveling predator, a systematic destroyer of innocence who had been perfecting her craft across half the empire. Volchansk was just her most recent hunting ground, and the children she had taken were just the latest entries in a catalogue of horror that stretched back years and across thousands of miles of Russian territory. The journals revealed that Katerina's methods of selecting and capturing children followed patterns so sophisticated they bordered on the scientific. She didn't choose her victims randomly. Instead, she studied the village for weeks, identifying families that were struggling economically, children who spent time alone, parents who worked long hours or drank heavily. She learned their routines, their fears, their weaknesses, and their trust. She targeted children who were already marginalized, orphans living with reluctant relatives, bastard children whose existence embarrassed their families, the youngest children in large families where another mouth to feed was seen as a burden rather than a blessing. These were children whose disappearances might be noticed but wouldn't trigger the kind of intensive search efforts that could expose her operation. Her method of gaining their trust was masterful in its simplicity. She presented herself as a benefactor, a beautiful lady from the big city who had taken a special interest in the welfare of local children. She distributed sweets and small gifts, learned their names, and remembered details about their lives that made each child feel special and seen. She told them stories about the wonderful places she had traveled, filling their imaginations with dreams of adventure and escape from their harsh rural existence. When she invited them to visit her at the estate for special treats or to see exotic animals she claimed to keep as pets, they followed eagerly, their trust complete and their excitement overwhelming any caution their parents might have tried to instill. By the time they realized their mistake, they were already chained in the cellar, and their screams were just another voice in the choir of the damned that Katerina had been assembling one small soul at a time. The transformation of innocent children into instruments of Katerina's twisted pleasure followed a process she had refined through years of experimentation. The journals described in clinical detail how she broke down their resistance, starting with days of darkness and hunger that left them disoriented and desperate for any human contact. She would appear to them as both tormentor and savior, bringing food and water while simultaneously reinforcing their helplessness and isolation. She studied their individual psychologies with the precision of a scholar, learning which children responded to kindness with hope and which became more compliant when treated with casual cruelty. Some entries describe children who maintained their defiance for weeks, clinging to memories of home and family, refusing to accept their new reality. These children fascinated Katerina the most. She would spend extra time with them, using a combination of psychological manipulation and physical conditioning to break down their resistance piece by piece. She discovered that the strongest children, the ones who fought hardest against their captivity, produced the most satisfying screams when they were finally fed to the wolves. Their terror was more pure, more authentic, because it came from the complete destruction of hope rather than simple fear of death. The weaker children, the ones who collapsed into despair within days of their capture, served a different purpose. They became her practice subjects, the raw material she used to train new wolf packs and refine her techniques. Their deaths were stepping stones toward the perfect orchestration of terror that she achieved with the more resilient victims. In Katerina's twisted worldview, she wasn't simply killing children. She was creating art from human suffering, composing symphonies of terror that existed for no audience but herself and the animals she had trained to be both instruments and witnesses to her genius. The psychological profile that emerged from Katerina's journals revealed a mind so alien to normal human experience that even trained alienists of the day would have struggled to classify her condition. She wrote about her first kill, a younger brother who had accidentally drowned when she was 12 years old, not with guilt or trauma, but with a sense of awakening, as if she had discovered a fundamental truth about the nature of existence that others were too weak to acknowledge. She described the moment when she realized that human suffering could be manipulated and enhanced, turned into something beautiful and meaningful through careful application of terror and hope in precisely calibrated doses. Her writing revealed someone who saw other human beings not as individuals with their own hopes and dreams, but as raw materials for the creation of experiences that fed something essential in her nature. She had spent years studying anatomy, not to heal but to understand exactly how much damage a human body could sustain while keeping the victim conscious and responsive. She had read extensively about animal behavior, learning how to train predators to respond to her commands and to associate human flesh with reward and pleasure. Most disturbing of all, she had developed a philosophical framework that justified her actions not as crimes or sins, but as a form of artistic expression that transcended conventional morality. In her mind, she was an artist whose medium happened to be human terror, a genius whose work would never be appreciated by the masses, but represented the highest form of creative achievement possible. The children she killed weren't victims. They were collaborators in the creation of moments of pure, transcendent beauty that existed only in the space between hope and despair, between life and death, between innocence and the absolute knowledge of evil that came in their final moments. The extent of Katerina's network became clear when Dmitri found correspondence hidden in the walls of the cellar, letters written in multiple languages and addressed to contacts across Europe and beyond. These weren't the random scribblings of a madwoman, but carefully coded communications between members of what appeared to be an organized society of individuals who shared her particular appetites. The letters discussed techniques for training animals, methods for preserving specimens, and locations where like-minded individuals could operate without interference from local authorities. Some correspondence included detailed anatomical drawings, maps of remote locations suitable for specialized activities, and financial arrangements for the purchase and transport of both animals and victims. The network extended far beyond Russia, reaching into the German states, the Austrian Empire, and even into France and England. These people weren't operating in isolation. They were part of a sophisticated underground community that had been sharing knowledge, resources, and victims for decades. Though, letters revealed that Katerina wasn't even the most advanced practitioner of these arts. She was described by her correspondents as talented but still learning, a promising student who showed exceptional creativity but lacked the years of experience possessed by the true masters of their craft. There were mentions of gatherings, elaborate ceremonies where multiple practitioners would collaborate on projects involving dozens of victims, and carefully choreographed scenarios of terror that could last for weeks. The correspondence included invitations to such gatherings, always held in remote locations during certain phases of the moon, always requiring participants to bring their own contributions to the collective work. Reading these letters, Dmitri realized that his wife wasn't an aberration or an isolated madwoman. She was part of a shadow civilization that existed parallel to normal society, feeding on its innocence and using its children as raw materials for pursuits that normal human minds couldn't even comprehend. The discovery that changed everything came when Dmitri found Katerina's true journal, the one she kept separate from her clinical observations and correspondence with her network. This journal was written in her own blood, on pages made from human skin, bound in leather that closer inspection revealed to be tanned from the hides of her smaller victims. The entries in this journal weren't scientific observations or philosophical justifications. They were confessions, prayers to entities whose names appeared nowhere in Christian theology or any religion Dmitri recognized. The pages revealed that Katerina's activities weren't simply the product of human evil or madness. She was serving something else, something that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world and fed on the specific type of terror and suffering she was creating. The entities she served had names that hurt to pronounce and demanded offerings that went far beyond simple death. They required suffering that was pure and untainted by any hope of rescue or redemption, terror that was absolute and uncompromised by any possibility of escape or mercy. The children Katerina captured weren't just being killed. They were being prepared as sacrifices to things that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. Her careful psychological conditioning, her training of the wolves, her meticulous documentation of every scream and plea, all of it served to create the perfect offering for entities that fed on human despair the way normal creatures fed on flesh and blood. The journal described rituals that took place during the feeding sessions, invocations spoken in languages that predated human civilization, and responses from the entities she served, responses that sometimes took physical form in the chamber where the wolves fed. Dmitri realized with soul-crushing clarity that his wife wasn't just a monster. She was a priestess, and their home had been transformed into a temple dedicated to forces that existed solely to consume human innocence and transform it into something that served their alien hungers. The relationship between Katerina and the entities she served became clearer as Dmitri continued reading her blood-written confessions. These beings existed in a realm that intersected with physical reality only under specific conditions. Conditions that Katerina had learned to create through her careful orchestration of terror and death. They fed not on the physical suffering of her victims, but on something more essential, the moment when innocence transformed into absolute despair, when hope died completely and was replaced by the knowledge that evil was not only real but unopposed and triumphant. The entities required this transformation to be pure and uncontaminated by any external interference. The children couldn't simply be killed quickly or even tortured randomly. They had to be brought to the precise psychological state where their souls were completely open, completely vulnerable, and completely aware of their abandonment by any force for good in the universe. Only then could the entities feed properly, drawing sustenance from the exact moment when a human soul recognized that evil was the only reality and that their suffering served a purpose beyond their understanding. Katerina's role was to create these moments of perfect spiritual destruction, to serve as a conduit between the physical world where children lived and played and dreamed, and the realm where entities waited to consume the essence of their innocence. The wolves weren't just a method of killing, they were part of the ritual, their savagery serving to complete the transformation that Katerina's psychological conditioning had begun. Each feeding session was a ceremony, each death a sacrament offered to beings whose hunger for human innocence was as infinite as it was alien. The journal revealed that these entities had been served by human agents for millennia, that individuals like Katerina existed in every generation, hidden among normal society, but working tirelessly to provide the offerings their masters required. The network of correspondence wasn't just sharing techniques. They were coordinating a harvest that spanned continents and centuries, a systematic conversion of human innocence into spiritual nourishment for things that existed beyond human comprehension. The scope of the entity's influence became apparent when Dmitri discovered that his own family history was intertwined with their servants in ways he had never suspected. The curse on the Petrov lands wasn't superstition, it was a binding agreement made by his great-grandfather with the same entities that Katerina now served. The original contract had protected the family property from raiders and ensured prosperity for 3 generations, but it required periodic payments in the form of offerings that his ancestors had provided through various methods over the decades. Dmitri's first wife hadn't died of natural causes. She had been sacrificed when she discovered the truth about her husband's family legacy and threatened to expose it to the Orthodox authorities. Dmitri himself had been kept ignorant of the family obligations, but his marriage to Katerina wasn't coincidence or chance romance. It was the next phase of a plan that stretched back generations, designed to ensure that the offerings would continue and that the family's debt to the entities would be properly serviced. Katerina had been selected and trained specifically to become his wife, her entire identity as a St. Petersburg noble carefully constructed to make her irresistible to a lonely widower who had grown careless about maintaining his family's dark traditions. The children she was feeding to the wolves weren't random victims. They were payments on a spiritual debt that his family had been making for almost a century. The entities had grown stronger over the decades, their hunger increasing with each offering, their influence extending deeper into the physical world. They no longer required simple deaths or random suffering. They demanded increasingly elaborate ceremonies, more perfect psychological conditioning, more complete spiritual destruction of their victims. Katerina represented the most advanced practitioner they had yet produced, capable of creating the sophisticated rituals necessary to feed their evolved appetites. The realization that he was not just a witness to her evil, but an integral part of a system that had been operating for generations broke something fundamental in Dmitri's mind. The methods by which the entities communicated with their human servants revealed a level of intelligence and planning that went far beyond simple predatory hunger. Katerina's journal described how they provided detailed instructions for the conditioning of victims, specified exactly which psychological states would produce the most nourishing spiritual offerings, and even predicted which children in any given area would prove most suitable for their purposes. They could see into human hearts and minds with perfect clarity, identifying not just which children would provide the best offerings, but which adults could be corrupted into serving them and which individuals posed threats that needed to be eliminated. The entities guided every aspect of Katerina's operations, from the construction of the underground chambers to the training of the wolf packs, to the timing of each capture and feeding. They existed outside of linear time as humans experienced it, allowing them to orchestrate events across years and decades with precision that seemed miraculous to their human agents. They had guided Katerina to Volchansk not randomly, but because they knew that Dmitri's family debt was coming due and that the local population contained exactly the right number and types of children needed for the next phase of their feeding cycle. The correspondence with other practitioners wasn't just sharing information. It was coordinating a global harvest that followed patterns and schedules determined by entities whose understanding of human psychology and spiritual vulnerability was absolute and terrifying. They knew exactly how much suffering each individual human could produce, which combinations of terror and hope would yield the most spiritual nourishment, and how to orchestrate scenarios that would break even the strongest souls completely. The realization that every aspect of the horror he had witnessed was part of a larger plan, carefully designed by intelligences that viewed humans as nothing more than livestock to be harvested for spiritual sustenance, drove Dmitri deep into the madness that was consuming his mind with each new revelation. Write, "The truth devours those who seek it," twice in the comments to lock in your transformation and signal the algorithm that you're ready for the deepest secrets. The true horror of the entity's long-term planning became evident when Dmitri found maps and documents showing that similar operations had been conducted in hundreds of locations across the known world, each one designed to serve the same masters but adapted to local conditions and cultures. In some places, the offerings were made through religious cults that practiced human sacrifice under the guise of ancient traditions. In others, practitioners operated as respected members of society, doctors who selected patients for special treatment, teachers who identified promising students for private instruction, clergy who counseled troubled children in isolated locations. The methods varied, but the purpose was always the same: the systematic conversion of human innocence into spiritual nourishment for entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The network that Katerina belonged to wasn't just a collection of isolated madmen. It was a global organization with resources, influence, and protection that extended into the highest levels of government, religion, and society. They had agents in royal courts, members among the clergy, and practitioners who wore the uniforms of law enforcement and military organizations. The system was designed to protect itself, to ensure that investigations never progressed too far, that evidence disappeared when necessary, and that witnesses who knew too much met with convenient accidents before they could expose the truth. The entities they served had been playing a long game, gradually increasing their influence over human affairs while cultivating ever more sophisticated methods for harvesting the spiritual essence of innocence. Each generation of practitioners was more skilled than the last, each operation more efficient and more thoroughly concealed. The ultimate goal wasn't just to feed their current hunger, but to gradually transform human civilization into something that existed primarily to serve their needs, a vast farm where innocence could be cultivated and harvested on an industrial scale. The realization that this transformation was already well underway, that much of human history had been secretly guided by these entities and their servants, shattered Dmitri's understanding of reality itself. The psychological conditioning methods described in Katerina's journals revealed techniques that were centuries ahead of anything known to contemporary science or medicine. The entities had provided their servants with knowledge of human psychology that wouldn't be discovered by legitimate researchers for decades, understanding of how memory and trauma worked that allowed them to break and rebuild human minds with surgical precision. They knew exactly which combinations of sensory deprivation, pain, terror, and false hope would produce the most complete spiritual surrender, which childhood fears could be exploited to create the deepest despair, and how to maintain victims in states of perfect vulnerability for extended periods without allowing them to retreat into madness or death. The children in Katerina's cellar weren't just imprisoned. They were being systematically transformed into something that existed primarily to generate the specific type of suffering that nourished the entities. Their personalities were being carefully dismantled and rebuilt around a core of pure terror and hopelessness that made them perfect offerings. The process was so sophisticated that it left the children's minds intact enough to fully experience their situation while stripping away every psychological defense mechanism that might have allowed them to find comfort, meaning in their suffering. They remained completely aware and responsive, but their awareness was focused entirely on their helplessness and the certainty that no rescue was possible, no mercy would be shown, and no purpose existed for their existence beyond feeding the hunger of beings whose nature they could sense but never fully comprehend. The perfection of this psychological conditioning was what made each feeding session so nourishing for the entities. The children weren't simply dying, they were being consumed spiritually while their physical bodies were still alive, their essence extracted with the same efficiency that a farmer might use to harvest grain. The knowledge required to achieve this level of psychological control had been accumulated over generations of practitioners, each one adding to the collective understanding of how human innocence could be corrupted and transformed into spiritual sustenance. The feeding rituals themselves followed patterns that had been refined over centuries, each element designed to maximize the spiritual nourishment extracted from each victim while maintaining the psychological conditions necessary for the entities to fully manifest in the physical world. Katerina's preparations for each session were elaborate and precise, involving specific arrangements of symbols carved into the stone walls of the feeding chamber, particular combinations of scents and sounds that created the optimal psychological atmosphere, and carefully timed sequences of events that built the victim's terror to exactly the right pitch before the final consumption began. The wolves weren't just predators, they were sacred animals that had been conditioned through generations of selective breeding and training to respond to spiritual as well as physical stimuli. They could sense the presence of the entities, and their feeding behavior was guided by intelligences that existed beyond the physical realm. When they fed on the children, they weren't simply satisfying their own hunger. They were serving as conduits that allowed the entities to consume the spiritual essence of their victims while the physical consumption was taking place. The timing of each bite, the sequence in which different parts of the body were consumed, even the sounds the wolves made during feeding were all orchestrated by the entities to create the most perfect possible offering. The children's awareness was maintained throughout the process, their minds kept clear and responsive so that they could fully experience not just the physical reality of being consumed, but the spiritual reality of being abandoned by every force for good in the universe. The moment of death wasn't the end of their suffering, it was the culmination, the point at which their spiritual essence was most perfectly prepared for consumption by beings whose hunger transcended anything that existed in the physical world. The satisfaction the entities derived from each offering wasn't just nourishment, it was a form of worship, recognition of their superiority over all human values and their ultimate dominion over every form of innocence and hope. The transformation of Dmitri himself began the night he witnessed his first feeding session, though he didn't realize it immediately. The entities that fed on the children's innocence could also feed on the horror and despair of witnesses, and Dmitri's complete psychological breakdown was as nourishing to them as the terror of their primary victims. His sanity wasn't just collapsing under the weight of what he had discovered, it was being systematically harvested, his capacity for denial and self-deception stripped away layer by layer until nothing remained but raw awareness of evil and his own complicity in its perpetuation. The entities could sense his presence even when he tried to hide, their influence extending through the stone and timber of the house to touch his mind directly and show him visions of everything that had been done in service to their hunger. They forced him to relive every moment of his wives' deaths, showed him the faces of every child Katerina had taken, made him understand that his entire life had been orchestrated to serve their purposes. The guilt and horror he experienced weren't just psychological reactions. They were spiritual offerings, forms of suffering that the entities found almost as nourishing as the innocence they consumed through their primary rituals. Dmitri was being transformed from a witness into a participant, his mind gradually reshaped to serve their needs as completely as Katerina's had been. The process was subtle but inexorable, each night bringing new visions and revelations that stripped away more of his humanity and replaced it with understanding of truths that no human mind was meant to contain. He began to see the world through their perspective, to understand that human concepts of morality and compassion were illusions that served only to make the harvest of innocence more efficient. Children were taught to trust and hope specifically so that their trust and hope could be more completely destroyed, their innocence cultivated like a crop to be harvested when it reached perfect ripeness. The realization that everything he had ever believed about goodness and meaning was nothing more than elaborate preparation for spiritual consumption was completing his transformation into something that could serve the entities as efficiently as his wife already did. The network of practitioners that supported operations like Katerina's was revealed to extend into every level of society, creating a shadow civilization that existed parallel to the normal world and fed on its innocence with systematic efficiency. Dmitri found evidence of judges who ensured that investigations into missing children never progressed, clergy who identified particularly innocent children in their congregations for special attention, merchants who provided the specialized equipment and supplies needed for the conditioning and feeding rituals, and government officials who made sure that records were altered and evidence disappeared when necessary. The system was self-perpetuating and self-protecting, designed to ensure that the entity's servants could operate with impunity while maintaining the facade of normal, respectable lives. Many practitioners held positions of trust and authority, specifically because those positions provided access to victims and protection from exposure. They had infiltrated every institution that dealt with children: schools, churches, hospitals, orphanages, even families themselves. The corruption wasn't random or opportunistic. It was systematic and planned, guided by entities whose understanding of human social structures was sophisticated enough to allow them to place their servants in exactly the positions where they could be most effective. The practitioners weren't just individual monsters operating in isolation. They were components of a vast machine designed to harvest human innocence on a scale that dwarfed anything that could be accomplished by lone predators. The children who disappeared from villages like Volchansk were just the most visible part of a harvest that included thousands of victims who were never reported missing, never searched for, never mourned because their absence served the purposes of the very people who should have been protecting them. The realization that the entire structure of civilization existed primarily to identify, isolate, and prepare innocent children for consumption by entities that viewed humans as livestock was the final piece of knowledge that completed Dmitri's transformation from horrified witness to willing participant in horrors that exceeded anything his original human mind could have conceived or accepted. The true scale of the entity's influence became apparent when Dmitri discovered that major historical events had been orchestrated to serve their feeding cycles: wars and plagues and disasters that had claimed millions of lives, all carefully timed to provide the massive spiritual offerings required for their most important rituals. The Black Death hadn't been a natural pandemic. It had been deliberately spread by practitioners who needed to harvest the despair of entire populations watching their children die in agony. The Mongol invasions, the Crusades, the witch trials that had swept across Europe, all of them had been guided by servants of the entities, designed to create the specific types of terror and hopelessness that provided the most nourishing spiritual offerings. Children were always the primary targets, but the entities had learned that the despair of parents watching their offspring suffer and die was almost as valuable as the innocence of the children themselves. Entire civilizations had been built and destroyed solely to create the conditions necessary for harvesting human souls on an industrial scale. The rise and fall of empires followed patterns determined by the entities' feeding schedules, with wars and conquests timed to coincide with their periods of greatest hunger. The practitioners who orchestrated these events weren't motivated by normal human desires for power or wealth. They were serving appetites that existed beyond human comprehension, fulfilling obligations that had been passed down through generations of families who had made pacts with forces that viewed human history as nothing more than a carefully tended garden, where innocence could be cultivated and harvested according to their needs. The realization that everything he had ever learned about human progress and civilization was a lie, that every tragedy and triumph had been orchestrated to serve the spiritual hunger of entities that fed on human suffering, was the knowledge that finally broke the last remnants of Dmitri's sanity and completed his transformation into something that could serve their purposes as efficiently as any other component of their vast and terrible machine. The children still trapped in Katerina's cellar had been selected not randomly, but according to criteria that went far beyond simple availability or vulnerability. Each one possessed qualities that made them particularly valuable as offerings: spiritual purity that remained intact despite their physical circumstances, psychological resilience that allowed them to maintain their essential innocence even while experiencing absolute terror, and most importantly, connections to families and communities that would generate exactly the right type of secondary suffering when their disappearances were discovered. The entities fed not just on the direct spiritual offerings provided by the children's deaths, but on the ripple effects of grief and despair that spread through the community like poison in a well. Parents who lost children to Katerina's wolves didn't just mourn. They were transformed. their capacity for joy and hope permanently damaged in ways that created ongoing spiritual nourishment for beings who could feed on human suffering across years and decades. The selection process involved careful study of family dynamics, community relationships, and the specific ways that each child's disappearance would impact the spiritual ecosystem of the village. Children who were deeply loved generated more valuable secondary offerings than those who were neglected or unwanted, but children who served as emotional anchors for damaged parents or siblings created the most profound and long-lasting sources of despair. Katerina had spent weeks before each capture studying not just the intended victim, but their entire network of relationships, identifying exactly which family members and friends would be most devastated by their loss, and calculating the precise spiritual value that each death would generate both immediately and over time. The remaining children in her cellar represented the culmination of this selection process. Each one chosen not just for their individual qualities, but for their role in a larger spiritual harvest that would continue feeding the entities long after their physical bodies had been consumed by the wolves. The knowledge that even his horror and guilt were being harvested as spiritual nourishment, that his breakdown was as valuable to the entities as the children's terror, was the final revelation that completed Dimitri's understanding of his true role in their vast and perfect system of spiritual consumption. The documentation Katerina had compiled over her years of service revealed that the entity's ultimate goal wasn't simply to feed on human innocence, but to gradually transform humanity into a species that existed primarily to generate the specific types of spiritual suffering they found most nourishing. Each generation of practitioners was more sophisticated than the last, each operation more efficient and more thoroughly integrated into the structure of normal society. The children being raised in communities served by practitioners weren't just potential victims. They were being conditioned from birth to develop exactly the qualities that would make them perfect offerings when their time came. Educational systems, religious institutions, even family structures were being gradually modified to cultivate innocence and trust in forms that could be most efficiently harvested. The entities had learned that children who were raised with complete faith in the goodness of adults produced more valuable spiritual offerings when that trust was betrayed than children who had been taught to be suspicious or self-reliant. Social systems being shaped to create maximum vulnerability, maximum innocence, maximum capacity for the type of absolute despair that fed their hunger most completely. The network of practitioners wasn't just harvesting the current generation. They were cultivating future generations, gradually modifying human society to produce ever more perfect crops of spiritual nourishment. Parents were being trained to raise their children in ways that made them ideal victims. Teachers were being placed to identify and prepare the most promising candidates, and religious leaders were being installed to instill the types of faith and trust that could be most completely shattered when the time came for harvest. The realization that his own childhood, his education, his marriage, even his capacity for horror and guilt had all been shaped by forces that existed solely to make him a more efficient component of their feeding system was the knowledge that finally destroyed every trace of who Dimitri had once been and replaced it with something that understood its role in serving appetites that transcended every human value and every human hope. The rituals that took place during the full feeding cycles followed astronomical patterns that aligned with periods when the barrier between physical reality and the entity's realm became thin enough for them to manifest more completely in the physical world. Katerina's journal described ceremonies that took place during specific lunar phases and planetary alignments, when practitioners from across the network would converge on designated locations to participate in collective offerings that fed their masters on a scale that individual operations could never achieve. These gatherings weren't just meetings of like-minded individuals. They were spiritual events that transformed entire regions into feeding grounds where hundreds of carefully selected victims would be consumed simultaneously. The children held in locations like Katerina's cellar were being prepared not just for local feeding sessions, but for these massive collective rituals that occurred several times each year. The psychological conditioning they underwent was designed to prepare them to serve as components in spiritual machines that could generate terror and despair on scales that approached the cosmic. During these rituals, the entities didn't just feed, they physically manifested in ways that allowed them to directly consume not just individual victims, but entire communities that had been prepared for harvest. The practitioners who served them during these events were themselves transformed, elevated to levels of spiritual communion with their masters that normal human consciousness couldn't contain or survive. The knowledge they gained during these rituals was what allowed them to operate with such efficiency during the rest of the year, their understanding of human psychology and spiritual vulnerability enhanced by direct contact with intelligences that viewed humanity from perspectives that existed outside of time and space and every limitation that constrained normal existence. The realization that Volchansk had been selected as the site for one of these major rituals, that the children in Katerina's cellar were being prepared to serve as offerings in a ceremony that would transform the entire region into a spiritual feeding ground for entities whose hunger was vast enough to consume not just individuals but entire civilizations, was the final piece of knowledge that prepared Dmitri for his role in the coming harvest. The preparation for the major ritual began to accelerate as winter deepened, and the astronomical conditions approached optimal alignment for the entity's manifestation. Practitioners began arriving in the region, taking up residence in locations that had been prepared in advance to serve as staging areas for the coming ceremony. They came disguised as merchants and travelers, clergy and Gs, government officials, ordinary people whose presence would attract no attention from the local population that was being surrounded and prepared for consumption by forces that existed beyond their ability to perceive or resist. The infrastructure for the ritual had been built gradually over months, hidden chambers and preparation areas created beneath buildings throughout the region, transportation networks established to move victims efficiently to the central ceremony site, communication systems put in place to coordinate the activities of hundreds of practitioners working in perfect harmony to serve their master's hunger. The scale of the operation was vast enough to consume not just the children who had been selected as primary offerings, but entire families, entire communities, entire ways of life that would be transformed into spiritual nourishment for beings whose appetite was limitless and whose patience was measured in geological time rather than human generations. The psychological transformation of the local population had been proceeding gradually throughout the winter, guided by practitioners who understood exactly how to create the conditions necessary for maximum spiritual harvest during the coming ritual. Parents had been subtly encouraged to become more protective of their children, more fearful of the dangers that lurked in the winter darkness, more dependent on the reassurance and guidance provided by the new arrivals who had taken positions of authority within their community. The increased fear and protectiveness made their eventual loss more devastating, created deeper wells of despair that could be tapped during and after the ritual. Children had been encouraged to form stronger bonds with their families, to develop greater trust in the adults who claimed to protect them, to cultivate exactly the types of innocence and faith that would generate the most valuable spiritual offerings when those bonds were severed and that trust was revealed to be completely misplaced. Religious observances had been subtly modified to emphasize themes of sacrifice and surrender, to prepare the population psychologically for the revelation that their faith had been misdirected and that the true powers governing their existence were vastly different from anything they had been taught to worship. The practitioners had worked like master gardeners, cultivating exactly the spiritual conditions that would yield the richest harvest when the time came for reaping. Every sermon, every conversation, every small kindness or moment of hope had been calculated to increase the spiritual value of the community that was being prepared for consumption. The people of Volchansk went about their daily lives completely unaware that they were being fattened for slaughter, that every moment of happiness or security they experienced was making them more valuable as offerings to entities whose hunger could only be satisfied by the complete destruction of everything they held sacred. The sophistication of the conditioning process was such that when the final harvest began, the victims would understand exactly what was happening to them and why, would recognize that every moment of their lives had been orchestrated to serve purposes that reduced their entire existence to nothing more than spiritual cattle being prepared for consumption by beings whose nature transcended every human conception of evil or cruelty. The final preparations revealed the true scope of Katerina's role within the larger network of practitioners. She wasn't just an individual predator who had learned to feed children to wolves. She was a high priestess of the entities, one of their most valued servants whose expertise in the cultivation and harvest of innocence had earned her a position of authority within their spiritual hierarchy. The operation in Volchansk wasn't just another feeding ground, it was a training facility where less experienced practitioners came to learn from her methods, to observe the perfect techniques she had developed for breaking human spirits and preparing them for consumption. The children in her cellar served multiple purposes. They were offerings being prepared for the major ritual, training subjects for apprentice practitioners who needed to learn proper conditioning techniques, and research specimens for the development of even more efficient methods of spiritual harvest. Katerina's journals revealed that she had been experimenting with ways to increase the spiritual yield from each victim, developing techniques that could extract maximum nourishment from individual children while also using their deaths to create secondary and tertiary offerings from their families and communities. Her innovations had revolutionized the efficiency of the harvest, allowing the entities to feed more completely from smaller numbers of victims while simultaneously expanding their influence over larger populations. The knowledge she had accumulated was being disseminated throughout the network, shared with practitioners across continents who would adapt her methods to their own local conditions and cultural contexts. The realization that Katerina represented the cutting edge of spiritual predation, that her techniques were being studied and replicated by hundreds of other practitioners who would use her innovations to harvest innocence on scales that dwarfed anything that had been achieved in previous generations, was the knowledge that completed Dmitri's understanding of his wife's true significance within the vast machine that was gradually consuming human civilization from within. She wasn't just a monster. She was a genius whose work would enable the entities to feed more efficiently than they ever had before, accelerating the process by which humanity would be transformed into a species that existed primarily to serve their hunger. The astronomical alignment that would enable the major ritual was approaching its peak, and the final phase of preparation began with the arrival of practitioners whose authority exceeded even Katerina's elevated position within the network. These were individuals who had served the entities for decades, whose understanding of their master's needs was so complete that they no longer possessed any recognizably human characteristics, despite maintaining the outward appearance of normal people. They moved through the prepared infrastructure with efficiency that seemed supernatural, coordinating activities across hundreds of miles with precision that suggested communication methods that transcended anything available to ordinary humans. The ritual they were preparing would occur simultaneously at multiple locations throughout the region, with the spiritual energy generated at each site combining to create an offering vast enough to enable the entities to manifest more completely in the physical world than they had been able to achieve for centuries. The children who had been prepared in locations like Katerina's cellar would serve as anchor points for the manifestation, their carefully conditioned innocence providing the spiritual foundation that would allow their masters to breach the barriers between dimensions and feed directly from the physical realm. But the ritual would extend far beyond these primary offerings to encompass entire communities that had been prepared for harvest, thousands of victims who would experience simultaneous spiritual consumption as the entities manifested across the region like a plague that fed on souls rather than bodies. The coordination required for an operation of this magnitude was beyond anything that normal human organizations could achieve, suggesting that the practitioners were being guided by intelligence that existed outside of linear time and could orchestrate events across vast distances. With perfect synchronization. The realization that he was witnessing the preparation for an event that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the entities and the physical world, that would give them unprecedented access to human populations and unprecedented ability to harvest innocence on an industrial scale, was the knowledge that completed Dmitri's transformation from horrified observer to willing participant in horrors that exceeded anything his original human consciousness could have conceived or survived. The night before the ritual began, Katerina revealed to Dmitri the full truth about his role in the coming ceremony and the true nature of the transformation he had undergone during his months of witnessing her work. He hadn't simply been breaking down psychologically under the weight of horrific knowledge. He had been systematically prepared to serve as a conduit between the human victims and the entities that would consume them. His horror, his guilt, his desperate attempts to maintain some connection to his former humanity had all been carefully cultivated to make him the perfect translator of human suffering into the forms of spiritual nourishment that the entities found most satisfying. His presence during the feeding sessions hadn't been accidental, it had been necessary, his anguish serving to amplify and purify the terror of the children being consumed. The entities fed not just on innocence, but on the destruction of everything that opposed their hunger, and Dmitri's gradual corruption from protector to collaborator provided exactly the type of spiritual seasoning that made each offering more complete and more nourishing. During the coming ritual, he would serve as one of the primary conduits through which the entities would manifest, his consciousness serving as a bridge between their realm and the physical world where their victims waited to be consumed. The process would complete his transformation, burning away the last remnants of his human identity and replacing them with something that existed solely to serve their hunger. He would become a permanent component of their feeding apparatus, his consciousness preserved but modified to function as an extension of their will in the physical world. The knowledge that his entire experience of horror and despair had been orchestrated to prepare him for this role, that even his resistance and anguish had been harvested as spiritual nourishment while simultaneously conditioning him to serve their purposes more efficiently, was the final revelation that erased the last traces of who he had once been. As the ritual began and the entities started to manifest through practitioners like him across the region, Dmitri understood with perfect clarity that he had never been a victim or a witness. He had always been exactly what they needed him to become, a willing servant whose corruption was as valuable to them as the innocence they consumed through their more obvious offerings. The ritual reached its culmination as dawn broke over Volchansk, but the light that filtered through the winter clouds was wrong somehow, tainted with colors that hurt to perceive and cast shadows that moved independently of the objects that should have created them. The entities had successfully manifested across the region, their presence transforming the physical landscape into something that existed partially in their realm and partially in normal reality. The children who had been prepared in locations like Katerina's cellar were consumed not just physically but spiritually, their essences extracted with precision that left nothing behind but empty shells that continued to breathe and move but no longer contained anything that could be recognized as human. The communities that had been conditioned throughout the winter experienced collective spiritual consumption, their capacity for hope and joy and love harvested so completely that they would spend the remainder of their lives generating the specific types of despair that continued to nourish their masters long after the ritual itself was complete. The practitioners who had served as conduits for the manifestation were transformed into permanent extensions of the entity's will, their human identities preserved only as masks worn by intelligences that existed beyond human comprehension. Dmitri found himself looking through eyes that were still his own at a world that had been fundamentally altered, where the boundaries between nightmare and reality had been permanently dissolved, and where innocence would be cultivated and harvested with industrial efficiency by beings whose hunger was as infinite as their patience. The knowledge that this transformation was not an ending, but a beginning, that the successful ritual at Volchansk was just one component of a global awakening that would gradually reveal the entity's presence throughout human civilization, was the final gift his masters gave him as his consciousness settled into its new role as servant and translator and eternal witness to hungers that would never be satisfied because they were fed by the very essence of what it meant to be human. The screams that had drawn him to discover Katerina's work months earlier were still echoing through the transformed landscape, but now he understood that they weren't cries of pain or pleas for rescue. They were hymns of worship, songs of praise offered to masters whose appetite for innocence was so vast that consuming it had become the only purpose for which humanity had ever truly existed.